In 1974, a woman named Liz Carmichael walked into showrooms across America and collected $30 million in orders for a car that had never been driven more than a few hundred yards. That number is real. The car wasn't. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what America felt like in the winter of 1973. The oil embargo had just hit. Gas stations had lines around the block. People were rationing fuel. Congress was holding emergency hearings. And into that panic walked a tall, charismatic woman with a boldly simple answer: a three-wheeled commuter car that allegedly got over 70 miles per gallon at a time, when your family's sedan got maybe 13. She called it the Dale. Elizabeth Carmichael wasn't a name she was born with. She had built herself from scratch, and that talent for construction, for making something from nothing and getting people to believe in it, was both her gift and the engine of everything that followed. By the time she arrived in California in the early 1970s, she had a story, a presence, and an idea that seemed perfectly timed for the crisis unfolding on every street corner in the country. The Dale looked extraordinary on paper. 3 wheels, lightweight plastic body, a small rear engine. Carmichael's company, 20th Century Motor Car Corporation, claimed it would sell for under $2,000 and return fuel economy that made every other car in America look like a crime against the consumer. She gave press conferences. She got television coverage. She posed next to the prototype in magazines. The car gleamed under studio lights, and Carmichael's pitch was seamless, professional, and completely convincing. Here is the mechanism you need to understand, because it's the same mechanism that appears in every collapse this channel has ever examined. You don't need a working product to collect money. You need a believable promise at the exact moment when people desperately want that promise to be true. In 1974, every American who was afraid of the gas pump was a potential customer. Carmichael understood this at a molecular level. Dealers signed franchise agreements. Down payments came in. Orders accumulated. The $30 million figure wasn't a fantasy she invented. It was real money from real people who had looked at the Dale and decided it was their answer to the crisis. But investigators who later examined the prototype described a machine that could barely function. The engineering was, to put it plainly, incomplete. The plastic body had real problems. The drivetrain had real problems. There were questions, serious questions, about whether the Dale could ever be manufactured at scale, or at all. Carmichael and her associates allegedly knew this and kept collecting money anyway. California authorities began looking at the operation in 1974. What they found when they examined the company's books and the actual state of development was alarming. The gap between what dealers had been promised and what existed in that California facility wasn't a matter of minor delays. It was the difference between a viable automobile company and a shell operation built entirely around a prototype that couldn't deliver what had been sold. In March of 1975, Carmichael was charged with multiple counts of grand theft and corporate securities fraud. The state alleged that she and her associates had defrauded dealers and investors through the franchise scheme. The Dale, the car that was supposed to save American families from the oil crisis, had allegedly never been anything more than a very well-presented fiction. And then Elizabeth Carmichael vanished. She fled with her family before trial could begin. For years, she simply didn't exist. Law enforcement searched. The case sat open. It is one of the more remarkable aspects of this story that a woman who had been on national television, who had shaken hands with dealers across the country, who had a face that had appeared on magazine pages, managed to disappear for the better part of a decade. She was finally located in Texas in 1989, living under yet another name. She was extradited to California to face the charges that had been waiting for her since 1975. The court proceedings that followed were long and complicated. In 1992, Liz Carmichael was convicted of grand theft. She received a sentence of community service and was placed on probation. The dealers who had paid franchise fees, the people who had put down deposits, they recovered little. The $30 million in orders had evaporated the way these things always evaporate, slowly at first, then completely. Elizabeth Carmichael died in 2004. The full scope of her life story, which involves elements far beyond the scope of this autopsy, has been documented in subsequent years by journalists and filmmakers who found in her a genuinely complicated and in some ways sympathetic figure. She was, by many accounts, a person of real intelligence and real charisma, who chose to aim those qualities at a scheme rather than a product. The Dale itself, or what remains of it, sits in a museum in Nevada. You can go look at it. It is a strange artifact, a beautiful idea that couldn't survive contact with reality, preserved now precisely because of its failure. The lesson this autopsy keeps returning to, the pattern that appears in every story on this channel, is this: a crisis isn't just a disaster. A crisis is also a sales environment. When people are frightened, their judgment changes. They want the solution that promises the most relief. The rational question, does this actually work, gets replaced by the emotional question, could this be real? And in that gap between rational and emotional, between does this work and could this be real, every financial fraud in history has made its home. Liz Carmichael didn't invent that gap. She just found it at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right product, in exactly the right country, during exactly the right crisis. $30 million in orders. One car that couldn't drive. That is the Dale. That is the autopsy.